looking at self-determination and empowerment. And so I thought that I believed that there was an opportunity to build an economic agenda here in Australia. And the last couple of years, we had the International Symposium in 2022, and subsequently last year we ran a 6-part seminar series on the various topical issues that emerged from that. And early this year, we released the Muruwaru seminar series report, which also saw emerge a significant and prominent alliance of Indigenous leaders who are currently working to advance the economic empowerment agenda, both with government and also industry. So my presentation today will will comprise the following kind of themes. If I might go to the next slide, which is, of course, the economic self-determination, just a new fiscal relationship, what the extent of the challenges, and what are the drivers for the structural reform. How do we look at activating First Nations assets from a strength-based approach, and what that fiscal relationship might look like in the way forward. So if I might go to the first slide. So from a starting point, I guess, where we're obviously using UNDRIP as a basis that underpins our call for a new fiscal relationship. Because I think we all understand, and some of the things you'll have heard, some of this is rhetorical kind of issues, but I think it's important to put it into some context in relation to the historical legacy of colonisation that really has embedded the kind of barriers that continue to be the major impediments that exclude and continue to marginalise our participation in the economy, be it local, regional, or national economy. And I think that's something that cannot be underestimated, because we can't talk in academic terms about the nature of effective colonisation and the question of the ongoing challenges dealing with the trauma, the generational trauma factors that we all know. We all have families. We all have right across to people who haven't been affected by the stolen generation and continue to be affected by that, or other forms of historical policies and laws that have denigrated and subjugated our families. And I say families because we can say communities, but I say families because I think that is the very nature of the way that trauma is transferred. But there are also critical drivers for a new economic empowerment approach, mainly because of the social crisis and failure of the current policy approach to closing the gap and the emerging new renewable energy economy that Indigenous people must be part of. I think it's becoming embarrassing for the Prime Minister to stand up in Parliament over the last 10 years and say that we really aren't closing the gap. In fact, those targets are going backwards. There's a significant amount of investment. I'm not suggesting by any stretch of imagination that we don't need that investment to be able to do that. My view is that there are these ongoing structural impediments that are ingrained and therefore we're unable to, because of the nature of our federation. It's all Commonwealth money, we all know, but fundamentally it's applied through the various jurisdictions. And we know very little of that. And historically, not historically, but I mean, the Productivity Commission has obviously made comment on this before, but previous reports indicate that, about less than 30 cents in the dollar actually hits the ground on real projects. And but from a qualitative outcome point of view, significantly, probably less than that actually hits the ground. So something is dramatically kind of wrong in the inability of applying the investment in a way that optimizes the return for the benefit and well-being of our communities. I think that's stating the obvious, but we don't actually examine that as we should do. But I think the new fiscal relationship approach, when I talk about the renewable energy, I think this country has never pursued a comprehensive Indigenous economic policy. In 263 odd years since occupation, the Australian federated system has number of, has set up this kind of structural relationship with the states. I mean, those of you might also, know, as an example, the Australian Constitution, Clause 25, still actually allows the state governments to discount votes on the basis of race. While we were talking about the referendum in October and about the question of recognition establishing an agency or a voice to Parliament, one of the other areas, of course, the ongoing significant factor is that the threat of racism that is still embedded in our Constitution. And really, it's been 30 years since Mabo that we've had any reform whatsoever, policy reform, which is quite significant, since the 1992 High Court decision, and then, of course, the subsequent Native Title Act, then the Wick decision. But since then, we've had no significant institutional policy reforms since that decision. And so we have an opportunity, given that Australia has endorsed, of course, UNDRIP and now, since the release of the recommendations of the Joint Parliamentary Committee in regards to UNDRIP, we haven't yet seen a formal response from government, and I think in the current political circumstances, highly unlikely that we will see that. So I might have the next slide, thanks. So I think this is really what the challenge is. The Closing the Gap would demonstrate, while it's an important kind of program initiative, it's really a deficit mindset where we are seen as welfare mendicants, living off the kind of public purse largesse, and not as people who have a very strong position and can contribute to the local, regional, and national economy. And so we must come to terms with this strength-based approach about how creatively, we might activate what are now considerable assets. And I place that in the context of the government's future made in Australia and wanting to move towards becoming a superpower in the renewable space. The data clearly indicates that, post 76 land rights legislation and post Mabo and the Native Title Act, whatever the criticism are about native title, we've now have accumulated assets nationally about 60+%. And in Northern Australia, that represents, 80% plus of direct and indirect interest in the land tenure. While there are some issues associated with the tenure factor, and people talk about this question of fungibility, in my mind, there's no doubt that that we can only move forward through looking at more creative agreements in terms of the access, because where are you going to get the minerals for the critical and special minerals to drive this kind of revolution in the emerging renewable space? You're going to get it on Aboriginal land. And so the question is being able to make sure that we have the capacity and the ability to negotiate new modern agreements based on equity and recognition of our ownership to that land. But it's not only that. I think it is we have to embrace this question of wealth creation and wealth generation. The current kind of context of, I suppose, the economic policy is about wealth distribution, and that is kind of, while that's important because that fundamentally engages us in terms of the kind of policy program Closing the Gap. But I think the area of important attention for us is one of owning our own risk, and that is about understanding the fact that we're never going to be able to expect governments to meet all of the necessary demands to support investing and building a capable governance and well-performing organisations in the communities in respect to, the native title PBCs, the prescribed body corpus, clearly is an example of that. To date, there hasn't been the appropriate level of funding. I think roughly speaking, there's probably about $50,000 or $60,000 that those that may not have, a mine or potential kind of project that are able to attract independent revenue in to allow them some degree of capacity to negotiate with other interests on their land. $60,000 wouldn't get you a good administrative assistant these days. So So there are the structural issues like that. But I think also it's changing that mindset about how do we activate these considerable assets that we have in generating wealth. So the two things we're going to be looking at, I think, is this question of wealth creation, wealth generation, and wealth transfer. Well, at the moment, all we're doing is we're just basically transferring trauma to our communities, and that's just compounding itself. And unless we can move away, develop that independence away from government, develop a capacity to generate the kind of necessary revenue or income from our assets, for our considerable assets, notwithstanding, of course, as I indicate, there is a huge investment required to build capacity to do that. But why I say a new fiscal relationship, because it's not just about the traditional kind of economic empowerment or development agenda that governments have viewed this space, which is largely around, would be CDP and employment and training. But this is about the question of incorporating the question of access to finance, because our biggest challenge, of course, is that we've got all this property, all this land, but we don't have access to capital to finance. And so the question is, and we don't have the institutional architecture built around it in terms of the delivery of that finance. So the question is, how do we mobilize capital to be able to make that available? Can I get to the next slide, please? I may be jumping a little bit ahead, but I think that's a critical kind of point, because we've looked towards Canada for an example of what is happening there. I think that we're probably about 30, if not further, years behind what Canada has been able to achieve. There are other examples, of course, in the US and in New Zealand as well. But I think Canada, given the kind of similarities in the history of colonisation, but where they've been able to move in their relationship with government, and particularly in the last 20, 30 odd years, they've made significant advancement with their relationship with government, but also in terms of setting up the new kind of architecture around being able to build capability in First Nation communities and be able to attract the capital. An example would be the 2005 Fiscal Management Act, which has established the Financial Management Board, about 4 key institutions that are there to facilitate the major move away from operations under the Indian Affairs Act and more into the mainstream economy. And they're the Financial Management Board, which has been set up to provide accreditation. Some of you already might know this and might have studied it, so you'll know what I'm talking about, to accredit those communities who want to opt out of the operations under the Indian Affairs Act, to be able to ensure that there is the wraparound support services for building capable governance and organisations able to comply with kind of regulations associated with setting up their governance structure. And then, of course, they have their own financial authority, which is able to assist with accessing both public and private capital. And then the other organisations, the Land Advisory Body, and then, of course, their own tax commission, where they have a different history with taxation than we do, in terms of being exempt from some level of tax, given that they're seen as based on the legal framework of a nation-to-nation kind of relationship with the Commonwealth and state or provinces agencies. Whereas we don't have that here at all. The last Canadian budget a couple of months ago, if you have a look at that, I think there was something like about $5 billion that was provided by the Commonwealth Canadian government to provide a loan guarantee facility for corporations looking to actually access that in terms of their own enterprise or investment opportunities, or to actually secure some form of equity in other major infrastructure and other projects around. So, and as well as, I think, something like about $230 million that went into building capability in those organisations. So they have a more positive intervention approach where they, in working with their Aboriginal organisations, it's more about helping them and guiding them towards building better corporate governance structure and assisting them to be able to train and for people in the community to be able to train up so they can in fact take over the responsibility of running the administration management capabilities there. Whereas here, if you look at ORIC's more of a kind of a punitive kind of arrangement where it's mainly looking to see if there is non-compliance and what does that mean in terms of penalising those organisations. So I think we've, historically we've focused on what you would anticipate and expect, which has been more on the social policy, as I said, the deficit approach, which is not deficit because it's necessary. The structure is deficit in the sense that there's very little control or investment in building that capability. There are an essential area. The social policies are obviously essential in health and housing and justice and the other areas. But if you will recall, in '94, post-Mabo, there was the three-part response by the Kitty government, of course, was the Native Title Act. Then, of course, the Indigenous Land Corporation setting up the Land Fund, which was then about $100 million drawdown from general accounts every year for 10 years, setting up the $1 billion. There was amendments to that in 2018 and 19, so that because that was previously managed under the Department of Finance, was probably roughly getting about 4% return on government bonds, and was going fairly backwards in terms of measurably dealing with inflation. And then now, with the 2018-19 amendments, there is this, they were able to set up their own investment fund under the broader Australia Future Fund, giving it a greater kind of scope in terms of its investment portfolio, meaning that it is able to measurably maintain the kind of value of its investments, where it's up around about $2 billion now. And similarly with the IBA. And so, but basically those organisations are clearly maxed out in terms of their ability to access current cash and capital with their existing kind of programs. So I think that's indicative of the fact that Indigenous enterprise and business is moving. I think the Associate Professor Michelle Evans from her research centre in Melbourne clearly indicating that in that snapshot report in April that something like, I think, roughly about 14,000 Aboriginal businesses contributing something like about $6 billion in wages, and the overall engagement of Aboriginal business contributing something roughly about $60 billion to the national economy. So I think that things are happening. But I just want to go back. I skipped over the in terms of the social deficit approach. The third part of the response from the Mabo decision, of course, was the social justice package. And the social justice package at that stage was about bringing together, looking at the nature of the relationship, a delivery relationship between government and communities. And of course, that was never taken up as with the election of Howard government, Keating losing in '96. Howard getting into government, of course, tore up that and made significant changes to the Native Title Act with the 10-point plan. So it kind of took us back a bit. So since then, of course, we've been framed. Our relationship has been framed by the culture wars in the politically in the larger national discourse, which of course has really sent us back quite a number of years. In my estimation, I think we've gone back 20, 30 years since that period of time with Howard raising the culture wars and limiting our ability to actually move in terms of asserting our rights position on the basis of the economic and social development, which I think with the social justice package would have significantly provided a platform to kind of build on that. So at the moment, we, as a result of the report that we provided, we have identified clearly a number of issues about institutional and policy barriers that are there as part of the kind of necessary structural reform I'm probably jumping over my slides, but so you can keep on going if you like with the slides, and hopefully they'll meet up somewhere along the line of what I'm saying. But but out of that Murra series, and this of course is by the Murra is a Wiradjuri word about the new pathways, and been looking at this range of institutional policy impediments, but how we need to be able to look at trying to unlock some of these things. So they include issues like, what are the current barriers to accessing finance? Because Indigenous land title, the native title, is not treated as a collateral as well, and also we have a significant number of very ancient, old colonial kind of reserves right across the entire system, and there's obviously banks and finance sector which treat our enterprise and ventures as high risk. And there's also very much the entrenched government focus on the deficit-based social policy, and little attention to how we might look at institutional architecture to advance this empowerment. But of course, there are other things that were commented and referred to, and which is about government dysfunction, which is characterised by the siloed practices, the lack of integration and lack of capacity to partner with Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal Australian communities. And I think that the fact is that, a lot of our organisations are caught up in the government system of dysfunction. I think that's part of the problem as well too. And there's very little, as I've already mentioned, attempt to invest in building capacity and support for PBCs and other native and their related entities. And of course, there's been very little appetite to advance Indigenous empowerment since 1996. And of course, I think last year's referendum of course,
maybe
entrenches Indigenous affairs as a political management issue. So there is a continuing approach to incremental reform, and there's really no decisive approach towards deal with this. What I say is this crisis. So in terms of drivers, slide 5, in terms of drivers for structural reform, I think we might we see this growing crisis. The government has been focusing on the Alice Springs situation. The Productivity Commission's already pointed out, as I mentioned, about the failure of the National Partnership Agreement on closing the gap. I think further, the recent election, Northern Territory election a couple of weekends ago, highlights this crisis about the narrative, around crime, which really masks the issues of long-term impoverishment and the despair that comes from being economically marginalised. And so I think the arguments we're putting forward, the arguments that we need to be putting forward is that it's imperative for there to be an economic empowerment strategy to work hand in glove with the social policy approach with the closing the gap. Because this is not a binary choice. This is, of course, something that are both entwined. The critical mineral space, I think, provides us with a enormous opportunity. As I've indicated, most of this will be on Aboriginal lands. We must be seen as partners in this new economy. The government's, Future Made in Australia, and the amount of funding they've provided that. There must be clear ways of looking at how we can attract innovative investment and finance. But we also, at the same time, we must be able to invest significantly in building capacity in our corporations. I've already mentioned the fact of what our kind of increased percentage in ownership and interest in the national land estate. That also includes significant interest in the kind of waterways as well. But also, we obviously can't forget the nature of the intellectual and cultural and property rights that we have. And just to, of course, reiterate that there is this growing entrepreneurial class in Aboriginal society. So I think this really needs to be pursued as a matter of national urgency. I think at the moment what we've done here through the establishment of the Alliance emerging out of the seminar series last year, we've engaged currently with the federal government. I met with the Treasurer late last year and I said, we've never had a a comprehensive economic policy in this country ever. And the fact is that there are continuing marginalisation and the kind of typical conversation you'd have about the fact that the social deficit approach will not achieve what governments want nor achieve what Aboriginal people want. Anyway, he was pretty interested. His response was, well, no one's ever really spoken to me about this, which I find to be quite amazing. And subsequently to that, we've been negotiating with the central agencies, the Treasury and Finance, and other agencies, I suppose the economic agencies, about leveraging the nature of these accumulated assets into this new in this policy environment position with the Future Made in Australia. But it's not only Future Made in Australia, of course, because there are these other existing. I should mention that the other existing special investment vehicles. There's probably about 10 of them. There's I can't remember all of them, but there's certainly the housing infrastructure and infrastructure fund. There's the Clean Energy Fund. There's of course NAIF. I should also mention that I've been appointed to be a third panel member, an independent expert panel on the NAIF review. So for those of you just getting a word in there, it'd be useful to be able to put a submission in or make comment to it. We will be travelling in regional Australia. The NAIF review was set up in 2016 and had a review in 20, and this review is a statutory requirement for 2026 to see whether it should continue or not. But it's a $7 billion facility. It's usually at the higher end of infrastructure investment, but its only reference is about the Indigenous engagement strategy. But there is a real capacity, in my view, to consider how those funds might be specifically available to be targeted, whether or not that's some form of agency representation of the IBA or IRSN accessing that capital, or whether or not there is a specific carve-off from that in terms of how that might then be seen as targeting specific Aboriginal investment enterprise opportunities. We do need to modernise our institutional arrangements in terms of supporting what we have. And I do think that the Canadian experience offers us a clear example of what we can do. So I think, in my view, we should be looking at a standalone investment, the First Nations investment and infrastructure authority, and our ability, similar to the concept of the special investment vehicles, where we can mobilise both public and private investment to support our engagement in industry and partner, through more modernised agreements. But also, I think equally there has to be that investment in building our governance capacity and our organisational and commercial capacity. And of course, another area is, I think, a key way of empowering that I think completely underestimated. I think everybody on this call would understand the power of data, and I think that's something we've completely underestimated. We've worked with a number of communities, organisations, Andalawakwa Land Council, the Ngalama Yindyabundi community in Roban, and we're now the Ngurra Yudha Corporation west of Alice Springs, who've come to us and said we need to be looking at this whole question of building data units so we can start to take control of the risks ourselves by being able to manage the nature of data, being able to access that. So that is a critically important area of the work that we need to be investing seriously in. And I think importantly, we need to be looking at these new opportunities for agreements, because there a lot of these our communities, PBCs now are starting to negotiate new agreements, what they're calling modernised agreements with major, mining companies about. And I think largely this has come about post the Juukan Gorge disaster, and it's not, but I think there's some dissatisfaction with some of those communities, from what I understand. They're talking more about the commercial relationship rather than the kind of nature of the fundamental rights-based approach towards that relationship, and how that can be articulated and manifest itself in building that governance capacity in there. And people are talking more about not necessarily this old style of the royalty payments, and how can the trusts be activated to be leveraged in relation to building a greater return on the capital that's invested, but also a greater control of being able to leverage that in terms of agreements with companies, but also particularly with governments. I think an important part of all of this, of course, is we need to allow the opportunity and build the capacity for these corporations to measure their own successes or otherwise. I think at a very much a place-based approach to that in their communities. So I think the other thing more broadly, I think we remain without a trusted relationship with government. I mean, we talk about just ending on the kind of issues of the post-referendum. We've never had a relationship. The Yirrkala Bark petition in '63 came out of the concern of the agreement that was struck with Nabalco in relation to the mining, bauxite mining there. You've also then got the Barunga Statement 1998, and then of course your Uluru Statement of the Heart. So if you see them, interesting enough, they're about 20 years apart, and you've had all these different policy, some policy, but mainly kind of program initiated during this period. But one thing that's failed, I ask myself, well, what's happened to these statements? And of course, they're hanging in the halls of Parliament House, and they, to me, cynically, I see them as kind of trophies of the colonial government, because we know our culture is based on reciprocity and respect, and those statements have been put by the senior people who've gone before us with genuine intent to actually define a more formal relationship with government, and that is calling for a formal treaty. We now have this huge question mark following the defeat of the referendum, and there's not likely to see any movement with that. Of course, the government will be trying to apply itself with a very small target leading up to whenever the next election is coming up next year. So I think that all in all, personally, the only way is if we invest in building our own capacity to own this risk, to look at this whole question of wealth generation, and to look at this whole question of generational wealth transfer, moving away from trauma transfer. I mean, just a last comment I'll make, but we need to work towards this kind of national settlement. But I do think that there will be a lot more court cases yet because if you look at the history, the governments have only responded to where there have been serious litigation, where we've been successful. So they're not. We're easy political targets, only making up 2.5 or 3% of the population. We're not going to get anything substantive from a rights-based position unless we actually take it ourselves. And the only way to do that is to be able to make a lot of money. I mean, we continue to operate in an economic apartheid environment relationship. The Pilbara area is the demonstration of that. It's the epicenter of wealth creation probably not just in Australia but the world. Generates about 75% of the revenue and profits for big companies like Rio Tinto, BHP, and all the other ones, FMG. But in the middle of it, and people have heard me say this many times, there's a Roman prison full of black faces. That starkly demonstrates the nature of the contrast and the challenge of why we need to move in this direction. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have spoken for so long.
Not at all, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for that very broad, historically located, as well as, with a consideration of place, overview of the stakes of economic reform for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the continent. I know at JCU there's a very active and engaged awareness about the types of economic transformations that are coming for Northern Australia, and the time has, it's always been important, but it's as important as ever to think about the ways in which Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples are located in that transformation, so that we can, as you say, reposition our relationships, not just in commercial terms, but also at a more fundamental and principled, on a more fundamental and principled basis. So thank you very much, everyone. Please join me in putting our hands together for Professor Peter Youth.